Hello friends, Jermaine here and welcome to this mini course. We're going to be building a simple contacts list application using Flutter and MongoDB. And what this app does is, if we look at the demo that we've got here, we have the mobile app and also we have the web version of it. So this is all using the same code base. The initial screen says no contacts listed. So let's go ahead and add our first contact. Adding our first contact will generate a contact and then add it to a MongoDB database. We can also go ahead and add a couple more using the add button at the bottom right. If there are too many for the current viewport, then we are able to scroll through the contacts list. In order to view this on the web version, we can click this refresh icon. And that will refresh the list here for the web. In order to delete a contact, we can click on this trash can icon as such. And in order to see that update on the mobile, we just click refresh to give us the update. And if we go ahead and delete the rest of the contacts, we're back to this initial screen. The reason why we're able to use the same code base for the web and the mobile is because the logic used to communicate with our MongoDB database is written in the backend. So there's a server that's running. So we're going to be implementing that as part of this mini course. And also we're going to be setting up our Mongo database using the MongoDB Cloud service, so MongoDB Atlas, which will save the need for us to set up MongoDB ourselves. If this is your first time to the channel, hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon so you don't miss out on future tutorials demonstrating how to build full stack applications with Dart and Flutter. And on that note, let's get into it. Before we create our server, we need to set up our MongoDB Cloud account and create a cluster. There's not much to it. You can click on try MongoDB Cloud and then you can set up an account. I've already got an account, so I'll go ahead and sign in. And I'll log in with Google and I'll just enter my details. And when you're signed in, you'll be made to create an organization. Because I already have an account, I've created an organization already and I've created a project. I'll go ahead and create a new project. I'll call this one Contacts List. And I won't add any more members because I'm already set as a member over here. So let's go ahead and create the project. Once you create the project, you're asked to create a cluster. And a cluster is essentially an environment that has got our MongoDB database set up in there. So I'll go ahead and build a cluster. I'll just select other for preferred language and continue. We'll create a free cluster and I'll leave the default options intact and I'll click create. So this will therefore go ahead and create our cluster and set up MongoDB with it.
A few moments later,
we can go ahead and connect to it, which brings up this modal. We're going to go ahead and restrict it to our current IP address. So this is my one and I'll add that. And then I'll create a user and then I'll create a password. And once that's done, I'll go ahead and create a database user. I'll go on to the next step, choosing a connection method. So in fact, we can test this out using the Mongo shell. I'll click and copy that and I'll open the terminal. Then I'll paste what I copied in here and we just need to change the database name. And I'll go ahead and enter the password and we are now connected to our database. So we can list the current databases that are there. I'll do use test to create the test database. And then let's go ahead and create a collection. Our collection will be called contacts. Okay, let's add an entry to contacts. So we'll do db.contacts.insert and we'll add our first contact name. Let me zoom out a little bit. So we insert that. Okay, let's list the contact we just added. So we'll do db.contacts.find and then here we have it. So that's good. I'll go ahead and exit it. And then I'm gonna come to the code base. I've got a client and server directory set up. The client contains a Flutter project set up and then the server contains a console-based application. In the pubspec.yaml, we've added two packages. So one is Mongo Dart. This allows us to connect to our MongoDB database. And this package allows us to set up a lightweight server. And then under the lib directory, we have a server.dart file created here with both packages imported. In main.dart under the bin directory, we've imported our server.dart alias.server, and then we've invoked the start function. Firstly, we are going to log into our database. We'll be connecting through our application. So if we click on connect, what we want is this connection string. So I'll go ahead and copy that. I'll create a variable called db, and then we'll do db.create. And this takes in that URI string that we copied. Our database name, we'll call it test. And let's close that off. And then next, we need to open the connection. Since we've already created our contacts collection, let's also retrieve that. And then our collection name, which is contacts. For now, I'll go ahead and print out our collection. And let's test this out right now. I'll cd into server. And before we run our main.dart, we need to set our password. Okay, let's run it. And let's not forget to convert that to a list. So I'll go ahead and run this again, which gives us a list containing our first entry. Second thing we need to do is to create a server. I'll store my port in a variable, and then we'll create a server object, so servr. And then now we can server.get. So this will be a GET request, and our route will be the root. And then the second argument is a list of callback functions. And then each function gives us two objects. The first object is a serve request, and the second is a response object. We will perform this operation. So I'll cut that there. We'll make our database call. Then we'll return a response. We'll set the status code, and then we'll invoke the JSON method. So in here, we'll pass in a map with a key called contacts, and the value will be our collection. Next thing we need to do is to listen for connections on our server. So we'll do serve.listen, and we'll pass in the port. You can also specify a callback, which is a function. And in here, we'll just print server listening on port, and then pass the port in here. Let's test this out. All right, we've got server listening. And if I go ahead and make a request to our server, we get this response. Let's go ahead and add another route, which will be used to add an entry to our collection. So we'll configure a method to handle a post request by invoking the post method on our serve object. We'll define our function. I will invoke the save method on our collection. And then to retrieve the payload, we'll just do rec.body. And then from here, we'll return a JSON response. And this JSON response will contain what was saved into our collection, including the ID. We need to go ahead and find what we just added. And then we'll pass in a special query. So we want where the field name called name is equal to the name field in our request body. Let's test this out. Run that server again. Make a post request. Set the correct content type, and then we'll pass in our payload to our endpoint. So once that's added, we get this response back from our collection. So if we go ahead and make a GET request, then we now have two entries in our contacts list. The last endpoint we need to is one for our delete request. So removing an entry from our contacts. We'll invoke the delete method. And then this route will take in an ID. So we can specify a path variable by doing colon and then the name of the variable, we'll call ID. And in here, we'll invoke the remove method on our collection. And we'll have a query in here. So where the ID field name has this value. So because the ID is of type object ID, we can use the special object ID class that we have here. So we'll instantiate object ID from hex string, and then we can grab the ID from our request params, and then I'll close that off. And once that's done, we'll just return a 200 status code. Okay, so let's try this out. We'll curl, make our delete request to localhost 8081, followed by our object ID. So let's delete our last entry as such, and then we'll run it. Okay, so that should have deleted it. If I go ahead and make a get call, now we just have one entry. We are now in a good place to progress to our client. I've gone ahead and opened the client directory in a new window. I've added two packages to this Flutter project. So I've got deal, which will enable us to talk to our server. And then I've got faker, which allows us to generate fake data. So we'll be generating our contact names. And I'll be coming to the main.dart file in here. And this is just a basic boilerplate that's been generated. I'll go ahead and get rid of all these comments. Let's run this app. Okay, so now that we've got our basic app running, I'll call it contact screen. And I'll rename these as well. Let's hide the debug banner. Let's set the titles for these as well. We'll center the title. Let's set the correct icon for this one. So we'll set the tooltip to add new contact. And then the icon will be person add. Okay, that looks good. Also, we need to add the refresh icon next to this one. So I will wrap this floating action button in a row widget, which means I'm able to duplicate this one. And then here the tooltip will be refresh list, which will use the refresh icon. Let's set the main axis alignment of our row to end. And then between these two icons, let's add a sized box, which will introduce some spacing like so. And then the background color for this will be set to purple. All right, so that is good. The next thing we are going to do is to render the initial screen. Let's change this text to say no contacts listed. We'll give it a style. We'll set the font size to 20, so slightly bigger. We'll get rid of this text widget and we will render a flat button. The child of this flat button will be a text widget. I will say add your first, and let's give that a style as well. And we don't need this extra parenthesis. All right, and the reason why we can't see that button, even though it's right over here, is because of the white text. So let's make this purple. We'll add some spacing between the text and the button. And then we need to add an icon here. We want the person outline in a bigger size. And let's give it a slightly lighter color. All right, that is good to me. To make this logic a bit more maintainable, I'm going to move this bit into another widget. So under lib, I'll create a folder called source. And in here, let's create a file called NoContacts.dart. We'll create a stateless widget. In here, we'll return this bit. So I'll cut all of that. And then let's paste that in here. Like so. I'm going to go ahead and create another file called contact screen. And I'll also import the NoContacts.dart file, which is because we are going to copy all of this in here. And then in the body of our scaffold, we'll render the no contact widget. And I should call it no contacts with an S. Okay, let's go ahead and import our contact screen. And we should be good. I'll go ahead and do a hot restart. Everything should look good. Okay, let's come back to our contact screen. Whenever we click add new contact, we want to go ahead and invoke a method called add contact. We'll rename this method. We'll get rid of this one. We'll create a list of contacts. We'll go ahead and add an entry to our contacts. We'll just add a dummy contact like so. For now, let's just make this an empty function. We'll come back to that later. So then in our body, in order to display these contacts, we'll have a condition here. So we'll say if the contacts list is empty, show this no contacts message, or else we want to render a list view. The children of our list view will be our contacts, and we're going to map over these. And for each contact, we will render a ListTile widget, which takes in a title, and we just render a text widget containing the contact name. So let's save that, and let's go ahead and test this out. So I'll click that. I always forget to do this. So whenever we map over that, we need to convert it to a list like such. Okay, so we got Sam Smith. I'll go ahead and we add another one and so on and so forth. Okay, this list style also takes in a leading section. We'll just have circle avatar. which accepts a radius, and then a child will just have these initials. We need to also increase the font size. We'll also add in a trailing widget. So this will be a flat button. The child will be an icon, and this will be our delete icon. Okay, we'll give that a bigger size. And also we need to set an onPressed function for this flat button. So that looks like that. We also need some spacing between these list tiles. So I'll wrap this list tile in a padding widget. And then the edge inserts will be symmetric because we want a padding on the vertical axis. So I'll save that, and that should space it out like that. Okay. In order to allow us to be able to reach the delete button on the last entry, I'll go ahead and so we'll spread these contacts in another list like so, which means that we can add a new entry with a height of 70. So now we are able to scroll the last entry upwards a bit to allow us to click on that. I'll go back to our NoContacts widget and let's implement this bit. So onPressed, when we click this button, we want to go ahead and add our first entry. And to do that, let's expose a function called onAdd. I'll define my constructor, and then we'll do this.onAdd so that when we click on this button, we'll invoke the onAdd function that we pass in. So in our contact screen over here, we can do onAdd, and then we invoke add contact. Okay, so that if I go ahead and click add your first, it adds our contact. Before we look at connecting to our API, I'm gonna move this bit into another widget just to help us manage this a bit better. Under lib source, I'll create a new file. We'll call it ContactsListing.dart. We'll create another stateless widget, and in here we'll return all of that. So I'll cut this from here, and then I'll paste this here like so. Let's import our NoContacts widget, and then let's define parameters. So I'll define a list of contacts, and then we'll have our onAdd function, which just returns void. I'll define my constructor, which takes in a list of contacts, and then the onAdd function. So which means here we'll just do onAdd, and back to contact screen, we will import our contacts listing. And let's just render that here. Let's pass in our contacts and our onAdd function. Let's test this out. I'll do a hot restart. And if I click that, it adds it. Also, when we click that, it adds another entry. Okay, that's good. Before we delete, let's go ahead and use the Faker package. I'll import that. And then in add contact, I'll create a Faker object. And then we want an auto-generated person. And in that person object, we want the person's first name and then the person's last name. So we're now able to pass this in here like such. So if I go ahead and click this, now we're able to get randomly generated names like so. Let's go ahead and work on the delete functionality. So on each of these list tiles, when we click on delete, we'll also go ahead and invoke an onDelete function, which will contain the contact's name, and then we can define that here. So this will be a function that takes in a string, and I'll just call it ID. It'll make sense later. And we'll say onDelete. And then right after here, we'll do onDelete. So this means for us, we can come back to our contact screen, and then we'll define our onDelete named argument, and then we'll invoke a delete contacts function. So let's go ahead and create that now. So right here, we'll trigger a set state, and then we just want to do contacts.remove where. And for each contact, you want to remove where the contact name matches the ID. And I was meant to call it delete contact. Okay, so let's test this out. If I click delete here, it should delete both of them. So we can go ahead and now we are able to delete. So if I add more and I delete it. Okay, so this puts us in a good place to start talking to our API. So our server is still running. I'll go ahead and create another file in here called api.dart. I'll import the DO package, and then I'll create a class called ContactsApi. I'll instantiate DO, and then I will configure the base options. In particular, we want to configure the base URL, which is localhost 8081 with a trailing slash. And then let's define the method to retrieve all our contacts. So this will return a list. And in here, let's make our call. I'll create a variable called response, and then I'll make the get call. And then we'll return our response.data. So if we remember, our response.data contains a key called contacts, which is our list. In fact, let's check the browser. So it looks like that. So we just need to access this, which gives us the list containing the ID and the name. Okay, so let's check this out. I'll save this, and then back to our contact screen, I'll import api.dart. We will need to make our API call when the app first loads. So I'll create a state property called loading, and I'll set it to true initially. And then we need to override the initState method. To use our API, we'll create an instance of our API here. So we'll do that. And then we'll instantiate our contacts API. This allows us, therefore, to make our API call in here by doing widget.api.getContacts. Once we have our contacts, we can do a state update, and then we'll set our contacts to the data that came back. And then we'll set loading to false, which brings us back to our build function. We'll have a condition to check if it's loading. Then we want to render a center widget with a circular progress indicator, or else we'll just go ahead and render this widget. So now doing that gives us that. Okay, so let me do a hot restart. All right, so doing a hot restart gives us that, which is from our database. Also, one thing worth mentioning, I did this earlier on, because this code is running on the emulator, accessing localhost 8081 attempts to access this directly on the emulator rather than this host machine that the emulator is running on. So in order to access localhost on this machine from the emulator, you need to go into your terminal and run adb reverse. And what you want to do is to do TCP : port 8081. So this is the port on the emulator, and you want to forward it to TCP port 8081 on this host machine. So if you run that, then that means you're able to access this host machine from the emulator. So now we've successfully managed to get our contacts from the database. Next, I want to create a Dart object which will wrap each of our contacts, because currently we are accessing it like such, which really isn't that pretty. And also in that Dart object, we are able to generate these initials as well. I'll create a new file. I'll call it contact. This will consist of a class called contact. It'll have two properties, ID and name. I'll make these type string. I'll create a named constructor, but this will be a private one, which will set the ID and then the name. So the reason for this private one is because we are going to create a factory constructor called contact from JSON, because the response that comes back is a JSON object. So we'll take each JSON object, and then we are going to return our private named constructor. So in here, we just want to pass in the ID from our JSON and then the name. Also doing this now allows us to have a helper to auto-generate our initials based on the name. So I'll do that by creating a getter called initials. And in here, I'll create a variable called names, which will take in the name, and then we'll just split it into an array. So split it based on the space between them. And then we just want to return names 0, and then we'll do substring 01. So we are extracting the very first letter from the first name, so which will be J, we'll do the same for the last one. Let's try this quickly. So we'll come here to our ContactsApi. We'll import contact.dart. And then rather than future being of type list, we want it to be a list containing contact objects. And then in our return, we'll cast this to a list so that we're able to invoke the map. And then for each item in the list, we'll create a contact from JSON. And in fact, let's just call this JSON like such. And then not forgetting to convert it to a list. So now we'll come back to our contacts screen, and then we'll also import contact here. This will be a list of type contact, and then this bit will simply be contacts from JSON. And this bit we want to remove where contact.name is equal to that. Okay, it's broken, but we'll fix it shortly. Let's go in our contacts listing, and then here we'll also import contact.dart, and we'll set the right type here like such, which means for our contacts list over here we can do contacts.initials, contacts.name, and then for the onDelete, the contact ID, which reminds me I need to correct that here as well. So we'll do contact.id. All right, let's go ahead and hot restart and test this out. And let's add a couple more entries. Okay, let's delete. All right, it deletes all of them. Okay, which is happening because when we add a contact, we're not adding an ID. So let's go back to our contact object. From the JSON response, the ID has got this bit. And when we are making our delete call, we need to send this string. So we're going to write some logic to remove those. And in here, I'll create an ID variable, and then we'll do JSON ID dot replace all. I'll copy this bit just so I don't type it wrong. So we'll replace that with an empty string, and then we want to replace this bit with an empty string. Then we'll pass in the ID here. And in fact, rather than making this a getter, I'll just create a field called initials, and then I'll move this over here, and I'll create a final variable called initials. Over here will be the name field from our JSON, like so. And also, rather than repeating this name twice, so let's create name here, and we'll store this here. Then we can do name, and then name, and then we'll pass in our initials here, which means we'll do this.initials, and we'll get rid of that. And I think I can make this a const constructor. Then let me hot restart. All right, I made a mistake. Should be replace all. Let me hot restart again. So I'll come back to our API, and then let's define another method which will create a contact in our database. I'll create a variable called response, which will contain the result of our post. Also, this method will take in a name that we need to add, and our doPost method takes in a payload. So this will be a map object with a field called name, and then the value is our name that's been passed in. We'll return this new entry like such. So from here, we'll come back to our contacts screen. Then under add contact, we'll make our API call, passing in the full name here. So then afterwards, we can go ahead and add the result to our contacts list like so. And then this bit remains the same because once our contact is retrieved, it will contain the ID. Okay, so let's try this out. Okay, so we got that working, and when I hit delete, perfect. We are able to delete as well. And everything should pretty much work the same. So no contacts listed, I click, it adds my first, and so on and so forth. All right, that's good. I believe at this point, we should be able to check that this also runs on the web. So let me run the web version of this and what I'll do is I'll build this as a web project. We'll do Flutter build web, which will compile our Flutter app for the web, and it will place all of it within this build directory that is just created. So it's still running. Okay, so it's done now, and under build, we've got the web directory with our Flutter app. Let's cd into web, and then let's serve that directory. So it's running now on port 8080. And then when I launch it, we are getting a CORS issue. CORS is, as an acronym, it stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. And it's a mechanism that uses HTTP headers, such as this one, to inform the browser that our web app running in this URL should be able to access the resources at this URL. So when the call is made, Chrome goes ahead and makes a request to localhost 8081, which is our server. A response gets sent back. The response header doesn't contain the setting, and because of that, Chrome does not go ahead and complete the full request. So to resolve this, we need to go back to our server and add a couple of headers, which will allow Chrome to go ahead and make the full request. So I'll put this to the side. Let's open our server again. In our server, I'll create a function. This function will have the same signature as this one. Here we want to set a couple of response headers, and then we want to add a header called access control allow origin. We can set it to localhost 8080, but I'll just put asterisk, which will allow any origin. Once we've set this, we need to pass this in for each of our endpoints. So for our delete, also for our post, and for our get, we also need to create an options route, because Chrome initially makes a request using the options verb to the route we are trying to access, which will return this header. And then once it's successful, Chrome will go ahead and make the actual request to the particular endpoints we are trying to access. So we do that. And then for our callbacks, once we've set our response headers, we need to actually end the response like so. So let's test this out by running the server again, and let's reload. So now we have this. We can add, okay, we can't add a contact. This is the same CORS policy. In this case, we also need to add in another header. So access control allow headers. So we'll come back to the server and let's go ahead and add our second header. With this one, we'll specify the headers we'll allow to be sent across to our server. So we'll allow the origin header and we'll allow the content type header. And we need to add a third header called access control allow methods. And then we'll specify the methods that are allowed. So we have get, we have post, and then we have delete. And let's run the server again. Okay. I'll pull back the browser and I'll reload. I'll go ahead and add. Okay, we are able to add new entries. Okay, that's good. Let's return to our API and implement the delete behavior. This will take in our ID. We'll make our call to delete. Then we'll pass the ID in and we'll just return the response. From that, we'll come to our contacts, and then over here, we'll make our call to delete our contact. Let's mark this as a sync, and then we'll update our list of contacts here as such. So if I delete that, that should also delete it in our database. And let's check this in the browser. I'll go ahead and build for web again. And let me kill this server and then run it again. Okay, let's delete an entry. All right, so we made a call to our endpoint and we get 200 OK. And we can delete as many of these as possible. Okay. If for some reason you're getting an issue when trying to delete, just amend this options endpoint and add an entry for this route. I can do that here like so. So I'll create a variable called calls paths containing each of these routes. And then I'll have a loop for var route and calls paths. And I'll just repeat this for both. So in here, we'll have the particular route. And then I can run the server again. You may not have to do this approach, but if for some reason you're having problems with the delete, then do this bit as well. I'll bring this back up and then I'll delete that. And then let's go ahead and add our first entry and so on and so forth. And you can delete that. So that looks good. the last functionality we need to implement is the refresh, because at the moment when we click it, nothing happens. I will create a method called load contacts, and I'll move this over here like so. When we are loading contacts, we need to set loading to true again. So to allow us to reuse this for when we initially load our state and later on when we invoke loading contacts, I am going to add an optional parameter here of type bool. I'll call it show spinner. By default, it will be set to false, so that initially when we are running this, load contacts has show spinner set to false because loading will already be set to true when this view is loaded initially. However, later on, when we set this to true, we'll have a check in here, and then to respond to that, we'll invoke set state, setting loading to true, like so. And let's wrap this like that so it's much more legible. Okay, so now we need to go down to our build function, and in here we will invoke load contacts, and then we should set our spinner to true. There should be exactly one entry in the database. So if I click refresh here, then it's now updated. And then let me build this web version again. Okay, once that's done, I'll reload this. Let's add a couple of entries here, and then I should be able to refresh the list. Let me close this server and run it again. So let's try this again. So I'll delete an entry, and when I hit refresh, yeah, it goes ahead and deletes it. Let's delete a couple more. When I refresh, it's deleted that. When I add some more here, and I refresh the mobile view, it gets the update. And when I clear everything and refresh, that also brings me here. So from here, you are now able to deploy this app, in particular the website and the server, to a service like Heroku. If you want to take up that challenge, I've got a video demonstrating how you can deploy your Dart app to Heroku. So check that out. And that being said, I'm going to end the video here. If you enjoyed it, smash that like button. If you are not a subscriber, hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon so you don't miss out on future tutorials demonstrating how to build full stack applications with Dart and Flutter. If you've got any questions, let me know down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.